Your name's not on the list, Moraine. Let's not make it a thing. That's what my sister's fiancé told me, after I'd paid for the tent, the cake, and half the decorations. No invite, no explanation, just a smile and a lock on the guest list. They wanted my silence, not my presence. But I showed up anyway. If you've ever been the one who gave everything, only to be left outside the celebration, drop a 1. If not, protect that seat at your table. Drop a 0. Because sometimes, family doesn't forget you. They just prefer you to be invisible. The message wasn't angry, just definitive, like someone scratching your name off a list with a smile. I'd skipped enough birthdays to not be surprised. But this time, it wasn't my choice. The apartment smelled like cinnamon tea and reheated pasta, what I'd cobbled together after realizing I wouldn't be flying out for Sloane's birthday. The card on the table from Aunt Gloria had no mention of me, just to the family, and inside, a pastel note about Sloane's party with a glittery sticker of a cake. Mom's message had arrived earlier that day. We're keeping it small this year. You understand. No question mark, no apology, just a quiet verdict passed like a soft gavel. I sat on the couch, legs tucked under me, scrolling through my phone. No missed calls from Boise, not in the last 6 months. The chat thread with Sloane had a digital cobweb, months since our last exchange, when I sent her a link to an artist's exhibition we used to love. No reply, just a heart emoji a week later. I reread the text 3 times, as if repetition would reshape its meaning. We're keeping it small this year, you understand. It sounded like a breath held too long. My thumb hovered over the reply bubble. I could type, of course, or no worries, or even just send a thumbs up. But I didn't. I let the message sit there, glowing against the dark mode screen, waiting for a response I couldn't bring myself to craft. Outside, the wind carried the scent of maple and damp soil. Portland always smelled earthy in the fall, like the trees themselves were preparing to shed stories. I watched a leaf spin down past my window, catching in the crooked gutter I kept meaning to fix. Everything felt crooked lately, off-center. Even the pictures on the wall tilted ever so slightly, as if leaning away from the truth. I poured myself a glass of wine, not to celebrate, but to mark the hour. The glass had a tiny chip on the rim from a dinner party years ago, one of the last times the family visited. Sloane brought Jake then. He wore corduroy and called me Marmar, like we were siblings instead of 2 people orbiting different moons. I never corrected him. It didn't feel worth the effort. I opened my drawer and pulled out a worn shoebox. Inside were old cards, ticket stubs, and a crumpled napkin from Sloane's 12th birthday. We'd worn matching seafoam dresses. Dad had played Isn't She Lovely on cassette. She laughed so hard when he tried to twirl her. Back then, it felt like a unit. Mom baking, Dad folding napkins into swans, and me adjusting Sloane's crooked headband. Now, even the idea of calling felt invasive. Dinner was quiet. The kind of quiet that rustles, not rests. I chewed slowly, my fork scraping the plate in rhythm. The silence wasn't empty, it was expectant. Like the walls remembered conversations that no longer happened and were waiting for their cue. I placed the napkin beside my plate, not folded like Dad's swans, just flat. Ordinary. The shoebox held other artifacts, a dried corsage from my high school prom, a keychain from our trip to Mount Rainier, and a mini Polaroid of Sloane and me building a snow fort, noses red and grins wide. She used to call me Big Sis, like it meant something, like I had gravity. These days, I felt like static, present but ignorable. I wandered to the kitchenette, started chopping onions more for the routine than hunger. I browned some chicken thighs, added rosemary, just like Sundays used to smell. The sizzle sounded like distant applause, or maybe just static. I had forgotten the rent payment until my bank app pinged. Rent for July. Keep stable. 3 months ago, Jake, Sloane's boyfriend, or whatever he was now. I still covered the apartment they used to share in Portland under my name. Sloane moved out. Jake stayed. I stayed quiet. I pulled out the lease paperwork. My name, neatly printed. Jake's signature scribbled like an afterthought. No Sloane. She hadn't lived there in months, but the rent still cleared from my account like clockwork. I told myself it was temporary. A favor. A bridge until he got his act together. But now, the bridge felt like a plank I'd been walking blindfolded. I thought about calling Dad, but that wasn't an option anymore. The silence around his absence had become its own kind of dialogue, one none of us dared translate. When he was alive, he had a way of diffusing tension with a joke or a plate of cookies. Now, the tension just lingered, like steam that never quite cleared the mirror. I stared at the payment note again, the words blurring until they looked like static on a broken TV. Keep stable. I wondered if that was a command or a plea. Maybe Mom said the same thing to herself when she sent that message. Maybe Sloane used it like a mantra, justifying every silence, every omission. I wanted to believe someone meant well, that this erasure wasn't cruelty, just cowardice. But intentions don't matter much when the result is the same. Absence. They erased me from the list, but I was still paying for the tent. Memory's a funny editor. It trims the parts they regret, then calls it the truth. I never wanted to keep score, but the receipts were there, stacked, time-stamped, undeniable. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts echo louder than the hum of the heater. Everyone else had gone home. I stayed behind, not out of obligation, but out of a need to be somewhere no one expected anything from me. My desk lamp cast a small circle of light, and outside, the Portland rain slid down the windows like someone erasing the world in streaks. I pulled up the transaction history. The payment stretched back 2 years, line after line, like an old diary you didn't remember writing. 725, rent transfer, Sloane. 312, urgent vet visit. $1,050, Jake tuition deposit. I printed them all, not because I needed them, but because there was power in paper. Digital could disappear. This couldn't. The printer whirred, and each sheet that dropped felt heavier than it should have. I laid them out like puzzle pieces on the floor beside my desk. I could trace the story back, each payment, each late-night call, each promise. "It's just temporary, we promise," Sloane had texted once when Jake lost his second job. I remember thinking how proud I was of her for saying we. I scrolled further. An older message caught me off guard. "You're amazing. Thank you, seriously." That was Sloane, after I'd covered their move-in fee. I'd forgotten that one. Her words back then felt warm, honest. Now they read like a footnote to a chapter she never intended to reread. There was one winter night I kept circling back to. Jake had shown up at my door, soaked from the bus, shivering. He needed a place to crash just for the night. Sloane was working late. The heat in their unit had gone out. I gave him one of Dad's old coats. He slipped it on slowly, like it meant something. "You didn't have to," he'd said, voice low. I remember shrugging. "It's cold," I replied. That was all. But in that silence, I thought maybe something had changed, like I'd earned a place in whatever they were building. Now, it seemed I'd been written out of that life entirely. I picked up my phone and scrolled to my photos. Screenshot after screenshot of transfers. One labeled, Rent Sloan, Emergency. I hadn't even noticed how often I'd helped until it sat there in front of me, in rows and timestamps. No one ever asked for proof when you gave. They just asked for more. Have you ever discovered that the people who needed you most also erased you first? If you've ever given quietly, only to be forgotten loudly, drop a comment number 8 below. Some debts aren't about money, but memory. I opened a new document on my laptop, titled it Ledger, not for money, for memory. I started typing out the transactions, adding short notes, not emotional ones, just facts. March 12th, covered Jake's missed payment. June 4th, sent funds for car repair. July 19th, bought Sloane's plane ticket to LA. I wasn't angry exactly. I was organizing, filing away a version of the past that didn't require imagination. Around 7:30, I packed up and walked down to a quiet cafe a few blocks away. The kind with warm lighting and pastries that were always a little too sweet. I ordered a chamomile tea and sat by the window, watching headlights glide past on the wet asphalt. The quiet here wasn't like the office. It had a pulse, a rhythm of plates clinking and milk steamers hissing. I thought of Baker and Sons in Boise. The smell of cinnamon and almond always hit you first, before the bell over the door even rang. Every year, I'd call and place the same order, chocolate almond torte, for Mom's birthday. They'd wrap it in that old-fashioned wax paper with twine. I'd write, "Happy birthday, love Marin," in the online note. Every year, they said it was delivered. Every year, Mom never mentioned it. I told myself maybe it got lost in the shuffle. Maybe she didn't want to make it a thing. But that silence built its own kind of monument. The cafe's Wi-Fi buzzed to life, and I synced my email, half hoping for something, anything from home. Nothing. Not even a forwarded photo of the party planning. Just more ads, newsletters, and the cold hum of absence. Back at my apartment, I laid the papers on the kitchen table and stared at the calendar. Sloane's birthday was 2 weeks away. The thought of flying to Boise made my chest tighten, but not from fear, from clarity. They didn't invite me. They didn't think they had to. But absence wasn't silence, and silence wasn't surrender. I circled the date in red ink. No RSVP needed. No grand entrance. Just me, showing up, present, accounted for. If they were rewriting me out, I'd be there to footnote the page. Some towns welcome you back. Boise just nodded and looked away. I didn't pack much. No gifts, no apologies. Just the printed receipts, folded and slipped into the back pocket of my coat, and a patience I'd long mistaken for healing. Not the kind that glowed, but the kind that didn't bite anymore when pressed. I returned to Boise quietly, with no intention to confront. At least not yet. This was about reading the room, observing who looked away first, and whether silence still meant complicity. I needed to see the pieces of the life I'd been written out of, scattered as they were, to take the measure of the house and of myself. The air hit differently the moment I stepped off the bus, dry, sharp, and laced with the faint smell of wood smoke. It was 48 degrees, and the wind cut across my cheeks like something half-remembered. Early October in Boise always felt like it was waiting for snow that never quite came. I took a cab to a motel off Vista Avenue. Nothing fancy, just beige curtains and a humming radiator. From there, it was a short walk to Memory Lane, which, in this case, meant the literal street where I grew up. I dropped my bag on the motel bed and sat for a moment, staring at the floral comforter. Same pattern they had when I last stayed here, 6 years ago. Maybe longer. I pulled my coat tighter and headed back outside, walking without a plan until my feet turned down 8th Street on instinct. The bookstore was still there, corner of 8th and Myrtle, wedged between the antique shop and that bakery that always smelled better than it tasted. I stepped inside and was hit by the smell of paper and cedar oil. The clerk didn't look up. That was fine. I wasn't here for chatter. I found it in the second row of the classics section. The Awakening, worn paperback, spine cracked like it had something to say. My father's copy had a coffee stain on the back cover and notes in the margins. He used to read it every March, saying it reminded him not to disappear into routine. I bought it without flipping through. From there, I walked past the elementary school, where Sloan and I used to meet under the bleachers during recess, eating the contraband cookies I'd hide in my jacket. Everything looked smaller now. Or maybe I just stopped bending to fit it. I made it to the old house by 4 p.m., parked across the street like I used to when I was home for college breaks, too lazy to pull into the drive. The lawn was trimmed short, like always. The wooden flamingo Mom loved still stood by the mailbox, paint fading but unbowed. I saw her through the bay window, watering plants, face unreadable. The same lace curtains fluttered slightly. She didn't look toward the street. I didn't go in. Instead, I sat in the car, fingers resting on the steering wheel, watching the scene like an understudy watching a play they were cut from. My phone buzzed. "Jake! Can't believe this weekend's here. You helped make it possible." No punctuation. Like he didn't want to oversell the gratitude. I stared at the message longer than I needed to. He didn't know I was here. He didn't know he was thanking a ghost. I walked to the bakery next. Through the fogged-up windows, I could see the staff boxing cakes and arranging cupcakes with tiny rose-shaped frosting. There was a printout on the counter. "Sloane's birthday. Pre-order 24 servings." I looked at the total. It was almost the exact amount of the last transfer I'd made in July. I turned and walked back into the wind. Back in the motel room, I laid the receipts out on the bed, lining them up next to the copy of The Awakening. Somewhere in the frosting and streamers, in the manicured lawn and rented chairs, my name had disappeared. Not crossed out, just never written. That night, unable to sleep, I walked behind the motel toward the patch of field that sloped down into the canal. There wasn't much there, just gravel, weeds, and silence. But it reminded me of Grandpa's backyard. He used to have this old wooden bench under the walnut tree. Summers, he'd sit out there with a glass of lemonade and a mystery novel, waiting for one of us to wander over. I was always the one who did. He'd tell stories, not about dragons or pirates, but about people, flawed and quiet and trying their best. One summer, after I'd been blamed for something I didn't do, something Sloan did and never owned up to, I sulked out to that bench and sat next to him in silence. He didn't ask what happened, just said, "Sometimes being right won't buy you peace, but it will buy you sleep." I didn't understand it then. I do now. The cold from the grass bled into my boots as I sat on a motel curb, letting the words settle. Boise hadn't changed, but I had. Or at least, I'd started keeping the receipts. Back in the room, I tucked the receipts inside the book and placed it gently on the nightstand. The heater clanked once, then fell into its usual hum. Outside, a dog barked down the street, distant enough to feel like background noise in someone else's life. Sleep didn't come easily, but it came. They didn't need to uninvite me. They'd erased me long before the guest list. He raised his glass, smiled wide, and said my name like it was a thank you note sealed with a bullet. The backyard looked like it belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Soft yellow lights zigzagged across the trees, casting gentle halos on the white linen tablecloths. The long folding table groaned under platters of deviled eggs, artisan cheeses, and a cake that looked too delicate to eat. There was laughter in the air, the kind that sticks in your throat if you're listening for your own name. I hadn't planned to be seen. I was content to remain a quiet specter behind the maple tree near the fence, half-shadowed and wholly unwelcome. But then Jake raised his glass. "To Sloane," he began, his voice clear, cheeks a little too flushed from the wine. "To love, to family, and to someone who made all this possible." His smile widened, unaware of the unraveling it would set off. "Marine!" A pause, crisp and unforgiving. Conversations clipped short. A few guests craned their necks. Others looked at their wine, suddenly fascinated. The string lights flickered slightly in the breeze, and for a moment, I thought I might still be invisible. But I wasn't. From across the yard, I watched Roberta lower her glass to the tablecloth. Her fingers clenched around the stem like it might anchor her. Sloane's jaw set. She gripped the edge of her sleeve with white-knuckled tension, lips parting as if to say something, but nothing came out. The silence was longer than it had any right to be. I stepped forward, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to cross into the light. My coat still buttoned, the heels of my boots silent on the grass. No one spoke. A few guests looked at me, then at each other, then away. Jake blinked. "Where is she?" he asked, scanning the faces, confusion creeping in. I didn't wait for someone to point. I kept walking until I reached the patio edge and stopped there, just outside the circle of warmth and wine and curated joy. No waves, no smile, just presence. That was all it took to rupture the spell. Sloane stood frozen, her eyes darting between Jake and me. "Jake," she said finally, a tight whisper, "we talked about this." "She's the reason we could afford all this," he said, too loud, too earnest. "Credit where it's due, right?" No one corrected him. No one thanked me either. Roberta shifted in her seat, clearing her throat, then took a sip of her drink like it might erase the moment. No one said my name again. I didn't expect applause. I didn't even want acknowledgement, not really. But I wanted the truth to stop being the thing whispered behind napkins. Have you ever stood in the shadows until the truth forced you into the light? If you've ever kept quiet just to keep the peace, and then realized silence protects no one, leave a comment number 9 below. Jake, sweet and clueless, had handed me that without knowing the price. He would pay later, probably in cold glances and colder nights. But for now, he was the only honest one in the yard. I glanced around. The people I grew up around, laughed with, shared holidays and heartbreaks. None could meet my eyes. Not even the ones I'd once braided hair with, swapped shoes with, snuck wine coolers with behind the barn. Under the low hum of the fairy lights, I remembered the other thank yous I'd received in this family. A birthday card addressed to Marlin. A voicemail meant for someone else that ended with a half-hearted, "Oh, and tell her thanks, I guess." A forwarded email where I was BCC'd on my own contribution. I never wanted the spotlight, but I was tired of standing in the dark and pretending it was a choice. I looked at the table one last time, at the cake I'd paid for, the chairs I'd rented, the decorations chosen using the Pinterest board Sloane once shared by accident. None of it was mine, but every thread of it had passed through my hands. Jake's glass lowered slowly. "Marin?" he said again, softly this time. I didn't answer. I pulled out a folding chair from the side, the kind no one reserves, and sat at the far end of the patio. No one offered me a plate. I didn't need one. The air was full enough. As I sat, the memories bled in like fog through the fence. Grandpa used to say, "Sometimes being right won't buy you peace, but it will buy you sleep." I clung to that thought like a threadbare quilt. I remembered other nights, less polished, more honest. Backyard barbecues where Dad would hum off key while flipping burgers, and Mom would insist the lemonade needed more sugar, though no one ever agreed. Sloane and I used to chase fireflies back here. She once gave me a jar with a ribbon and whispered, "It's for the wishes you can't tell out loud." Now even the bugs seemed to keep their distance. Jake stayed standing for a long while, holding his glass like it could shield him from what he didn't yet understand. Sloane whispered something to him, her hand gripping his elbow, but her eyes never left me. Roberta rose slowly and began clearing plates that weren't finished, pretending she had something to do. Truth had cracked the party open, but instead of spilling warmth, it had leaked something colder, something none of them knew how to name. And me? I sat still, hands folded on my lap, eyes on the stars that had started to peek out beyond the porch lights. Sometimes, the only seat left at the table is the one you pull up yourself. They didn't ask me to leave, but they stopped speaking like I was still in the room. The smell of burnt coffee clung to the air like old regrets. Rain tapped against the kitchen window, a steady, gentle rhythm that felt too soft for the silence inside. The overhead light buzzed faintly, the only sound beside the low creak of the floorboards as I moved toward the table. I set down the envelope, sealed, manila, unassuming. Inside, printouts of transactions, old messages, proof no one had asked for, but everyone needed. No one reached for it. Roberta stood by the sink, staring out as if the backyard might explain everything. Sloane sat with her back ramrod straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap like she'd been called to testify. Gloria, bless her, was the only one who looked me in the eye. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. "I'm not here for an apology," I said. My voice didn't waver, but it didn't need to be loud. I just didn't want the story rewritten without my part in it. The toaster clicked behind me, long forgotten. The silence thickened. "No hard feelings," I added. "Just clarity." That's when Roberta turned around, eyes glassy but dry. "You could have warned me." I tilted my head gently. "You could have invited me." The words floated there, not angry, just present. The kind that settle in the cracks, whether you want them to or not. Sloane shifted in her seat. "This wasn't about you," she said, almost convincing herself. "It was supposed to be simple, easy." "For who?" I asked, not unkindly. She didn't answer. I didn't press. I picked up my coat, the one I hadn't needed last night, but wore today for armor. On my other hand, the weathered copy of The Awakening. I hadn't opened it yet. Maybe I didn't need to. Gloria's voice cut the silence. "Will you stay for lunch?" It wasn't really a question. I smiled, not out of joy, but appreciation. "Not today." The floor creaked behind me as I walked past the fridge, the magnets still spelling out family, like some unfunny joke. There had once been a photo of me there. High school graduation, cap slightly crooked, Sloane holding my elbow because I'd nearly tripped. It is gone now. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," I added, still facing the door. "But silence doesn't make something disappear. It just buries it." No one answered. The scent of burnt coffee reminded me of Sunday mornings in this very kitchen. Dad used to hum while flipping pancakes. Roberta would roll her eyes, but never stop him. Those mornings were louder, warmer, full of imperfect grace. Now, the only sound was the faint tick of the kitchen clock, second hand dragging like it wanted to stop. I lingered, not because I expected anything to change, but because leaving still felt like closing a book mid-chapter. I stared at the counter, at the knife block, at the ceramic sugar jar I once bought for Mother's Day. Still there, chipped but present. I wondered if they ever looked at it and thought of me. You always needed everything to be neat, Roberta said suddenly, but it wasn't sharp, just tired. No, I replied, just honest. Gloria stood, walked over to the envelope. She didn't open it. She just rested her fingers on it, like acknowledging a grave. Then, softly, "Thank you for coming." It wasn't validation, but it wasn't dismissal either. And for now, that was enough. Before I left, I walked once around the side of the house to the garden. The rain had softened to mist. The old swing set creaked slightly in the breeze. I touched the seat, the chains still cold, still the same. This was where Sloane broke her wrist at 10, jumping from the top bar because I dared her. Where we used to build tents from blankets and call it castle time. Where I once told her I'd protect her forever. Promises made by children rarely survive adults. I whispered goodbye to the garden, not to them, just to the girl I used to be in this yard. She deserved at least that much. It wasn't about making them see me. It was about not disappearing on my own terms. It's strange how freedom feels like grief at first, like deleting a contact you still remember by heart. The rain hadn't stopped. Portland had a way of soaking the world in gray, and today was no exception. My apartment felt small but clean, light from the desk lamp pooling in a soft circle across the hardwood floor. The windows were fogged from the inside. My tea's gone cold. I didn't mind. The browser was open to my account dashboard, bank, utilities, recurring transfers. The cursor hovered over each line like a scalpel above the skin. I clicked cancel on the rent payment to Jake and Sloane. Then the monthly grocery card I used to send to Mom. Then the birthday reminder subscription that synced to my phone, one I'd built myself years ago so I'd never forget a single date. Delete, delete, delete. Each click felt like exhaling a name I no longer needed to carry. I walked to the bookshelf, pulled down the old binder labeled Family. Inside were printouts, scribbled notes, photos. I slid out the birthday list. Typed and laminated. I'd kept it updated since college, even added the cousins' kids. One by one, I fed the names into a small metal tray and lit the corner. The paper curled, darkened, turned to ash. I watched as Sloane's name disappeared, then Roberta's, then mine, faint ink bleeding into flame. It wasn't dramatic, just final. The ash clung to the metal like memory. I tipped it into the sink and let water rinse the rest. My phone buzzed, a message from Jake. "I didn't know the cost. I'm sorry." I stared at it. He wasn't lying. Maybe that's why I didn't delete it. I just didn't answer. In the closet, behind old winter scarves and a suitcase I hadn't used in years, was a box I hadn't opened since my 20s. Inside, a picture of Sloane and me at age 7, both wearing glitter headbands and holding popsicles. It was my favorite for a long time. I placed it in a new frame, one I'd bought last fall but never used. Then I turned it around, letting the back face the room. Let it be part of the shelf, but not the story I told myself anymore. I remembered the day I first set up those payments. It was late on a Sunday, years ago, the kind of day that smelled like detergent and leftover pizza. Jake had called Sloane from a payphone because they couldn't afford cell service. I'd offered, thinking it temporary. It never was. There had been no formal thanks, just silence stretched over months, then years. Little acknowledgments filtered through secondhand stories. "Mom said you helped them." "Jake told someone you saved them," but no one told me. In that quiet now, I realized I hadn't just funded their lives. I'd funded a version of myself they no longer saw fit to include. The benefactor without a name. I picked up a pen and wrote myself a letter. Not a journal entry, not a farewell. Just a note to say, I see you. You tried. You mattered, even if they never said it out loud. Then I folded it, slipped it into the back of the awakening, and placed the book on the shelf. No performance, no parade, just peace. Later, I stood by the window, watching rain bead along the edge of the glass. The city below moved as always, umbrellas blooming open like cautious flowers, headlights blurred in motion. I thought about buying a new plant, maybe a rubber tree, something resilient. There was no need to announce anything. The absence would do that work for me. Let them notice the quiet. Let them fill in the blanks if they ever felt curious. I had no more words to give them, only space. And in that space, maybe I'd plant something new. Before he passed, Dad once told me, "You don't have to win with family. Just don't lose yourself." I hadn't understood it then. I was too busy trying to earn love like a paycheck, hours in, value out. But I understand now. You can't invoice a family for the cost of belonging. And if they can't see you, you walk. Not because you're petty, but because you finally believe yourself worth leaving. I turned off the desk lamp, letting the gray outside take over the room. No need for artificial light. What remained was enough. The next chapter of my life didn't need headlines. Just quiet. Just breathe. Just me. Some ties fray quietly. And some need to be cut so we can breathe. I didn't say goodbye to them. I said it to the part of me that waited too long. It's strange how silence lingers louder than words ever could. After all that unfolded, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt lighter, like finally setting down a suitcase I'd carried since childhood. I've come to believe that family isn't always about repair. Sometimes it's about clarity, about knowing where you stand when the room grows quiet, and choosing peace over proximity. Letting go didn't mean losing love. It meant loving myself enough to stop waiting for recognition. If this story echoed something inside you, I'd be honored if you shared your thoughts, or simply stayed for the next one. Some stories aren't told to heal, but to help someone else feel seen.